Queensland, 1968. A field technician pries open a climate-controlled canister somewhere in the grazing country west of Brisbane, and 1.5 million dung beetles, alive, packed in temperature-regulated trays, tumble into Australian sunlight for the very first time. Within 48 hours, something extraordinary happens. Pads of fresh cattle dung that should sit on the surface for months begin to vanish. Tunneled from beneath, pulled down into the earth, gone. The soil is moving. The land is doing something it has not done, not once, in 170 years. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I spent 40 years watching ecosystems collapse and recover across 3 continents, and I can tell you this with absolute precision. The problem these beetles were sent to fix had been accumulating at a rate of 250 million tons of unprocessed cattle dung per year across Australian pastures by the mid-1960s. That accumulation was smothering 2.5 million hectares of otherwise productive grazing land, pasture that farmers depended on, rendered biologically inert, sealed under a crust that nothing would touch. Not a single native insect, not one. Here's where it gets interesting. Australia's native dung beetles had spent millions of years co-evolving alongside kangaroos and wallabies, animals that produce small, dry, fibrous pellets, nothing remotely resembling the wet, dense pads that a European cow drops. When cattle arrived in 1788, the native beetles simply did not recognize the dung as food. George Bornemisa, an entomologist at CSIRO's Division of Entomology, who had emigrated from Hungary and arrived in Australia in 1951, walked out to a fresh cattle pad one afternoon in the late 1950s and waited. He expected something, any insect, to begin feeding on it. He stood there and nothing came. Nothing came for 3 weeks. Bornemisa documented that observation at CSIRO in 1959, and what it revealed was not a hygiene problem. It was a functional extinction event, the erasure of an entire ecological guild. Australia had cattle, but no engineers capable of processing what cattle leave behind. Now, think about what that means for a moment. That unprocessed dung was not merely an eyesore. It was a breeding platform, generating bushfly and buffalo fly populations so dense that working the land in summer became genuinely unbearable. Every unburied pad was an incubator, and across 170 years of accumulation, Australia had built an ecological debt that no chemical program had come close to repaying. You are probably asking yourself the same question the CSIRO team was wrestling with by the early 1960s. If 1.5 million beetles were released and the results were this immediate, this measurable, why did the scientific record go almost completely silent on their fate for the next 35 years? That answer is coming, and it will reframe everything you think you just understood about this release. What Bornemisa had identified was a mismatch so total it defies easy description. Native beetles evolved across millions of years to process one kind of dung, and European cattle producing a biologically foreign waste stream that the continent had no mechanism to absorb. The land was not broken. It was simply waiting, with extraordinary patience, for the one functional piece it had never been given. From the air, the pastoral zones of Queensland and the Northern Territory looked exactly as a working landscape should. Green ribbons of grass along seasonal watercourses, golden open plains drying under a wide Australian sky, the geometry of productive grazing country. But Bornemisa's baseline surveys, the ones he had been assembling since his 1959 documentation at CSIRO's Division of Entomology, were painting a portrait the aerial photograph could not capture, because the crisis was not above the surface. It was pressing down on it. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. The catastrophe was not one problem in one region. It was 4 simultaneous documented crises unfolding across 4 separate parts of the continent, each invisible to anyone who was not standing on the ground measuring it. In the Darling Downs of southern Queensland, unprocessed waste pads were smothering an estimated 4 hectares of pasture per 100 animals per year. Not from overgrazing, but from surface accumulation, lying completely undisturbed. Across the Victoria River district of the Northern Territory, bushfly populations breeding in those pads reached densities entomologists estimated in the billions during peak season. A number the CSIRO Review Committee initially refused to accept as credible. In the pastoral zones of Western Australia's Pilbara margins, surface crusts of undegraded waste were measurably reducing water infiltration, rain sheeting off hardened ground rather than soaking through. And along the channel country of Western Queensland, where density was lower but accumulation still severe, intestinal parasite transmission through undisturbed pads was generating veterinary costs that graziers had simply absorbed as the permanent price of doing business on this continent. In the Darling Downs alone, the arithmetic was unambiguous. 4 hectares of viable pasture rendered unproductive per 100 animals every single year, compounding silently across a region running hundreds of thousands of head. Stay with this, because that figure was not a projection or a model. It came from Bornemisa's own ground surveys, counting pads, measuring coverage, recording what did not decompose and did not disappear, season after season, building a case that the continent's soil biology had gone structurally quiet. The mechanics of the failure had 3 interlocking layers: a sealed surface crust blocking rainfall from reaching the root zone, a breeding reservoir sustaining fly populations at continental scale, and a parasite cycle returning worm loads directly back into grazing stock, each layer making the others worse. You are probably forming a question right now, and it is the right one. If the damage was this measurable, this consistent, this geographically widespread, why did it take until 1968 to act? The answer involves a committee, a biological shortlist, and a sourcing problem that nearly ended the program before a single specimen was shipped. That is coming, and it reframes the 35-year silence that followed the release in ways that are genuinely surprising. Stay close. The early 1960 surveys had made one thing irrefutable. By 1963, CSIRO's documentation was detailed enough to present a formal case, and the program that would eventually ship its first consignment in 1968 was already consuming institutional oxygen. Debated, doubted, and quietly extraordinary. The pasture had not collapsed. That was the seductive part. The productivity figures from the 1960s looked functional enough from a distance, but what the ground surveys were proving is that a system without its functional guild does not fall apart immediately. It hollows out, invisibly, from beneath, until the weight of what is missing finally becomes impossible to ignore. What hollows out invisibly does not announce itself until someone tries to fix it with the wrong tool. And Australia spent 2 decades reaching for the wrong tool before it reached for a beetle. From the early 1940s through the early 1960s, the programs deployed against the bush fly and the buffalo fly were enormous in their ambition and almost perfectly futile in their outcome, because every insecticide campaign, every livestock treatment regime, every dung management scheme was aimed at the fly, and not at the undisturbed pad that made the fly possible. The cattle drenching programs alone, veterinary products purchased by graziers to manage intestinal parasite loads cycling through undisturbed dung, were costing an estimated $30 million per year in the early 1960s, and they did not break the transmission cycle by a single generation, because the physical foundation of that cycle, the pad, was still sitting on the surface untouched for up to 4 years. The fly baiting programs of the 1950s required continuous reapplication, not once, not seasonally, but in rolling waves across hundreds of thousands of hectares, and achieved, by CSIRO's own formal assessment, no sustained reduction in fly populations whatsoever, because the breeding substrate was never removed. Here is where the data stops being data and becomes something else entirely. The programs of those 2 decades were not failing because they were poorly executed. They were failing because they were solving the wrong problem, treating the symptom without touching the substrate, the fly without addressing the pad, the parasite without eliminating its nursery. Ian Daub, who became one of the senior scientists in the CSIRO Dung Beetle program, ran field assessments in the 1970s that produced a number nobody in the program had quite prepared themselves for. A single Onthophagus gazella beetle, one of the African species shipped in the first release wave, could bury a dung mass 10 times its own body weight inside 24 hours. A functional population of that species could process an entire fresh cattle pad in 48 hours. eliminating 95% of viable bushfly larvae inside it, not by killing them, but by removing the physical medium they required to survive. Daub had expected the burial rate to be significant. He had not expected it to be that fast. Now, if you are forming the question I think you are forming, whether releasing 1.5 million foreign insects into a landscape with no natural predators was a reckless gamble with consequences nobody modeled, I want you to hold that question and stay with this act a moment longer, because the answer the monitoring teams brought back from the release sites in year 3 and year 4 is something that reframes the question entirely. What George Bornemissa had watched for 3 weeks in 1959, nothing coming to that fresh cattle pad, nothing moving in it, nothing breaking it down, had cost Australia not just its ecological function, but tens of millions of dollars in chemical substitutes for a guild that would have worked for free. The beetle smaller than a thumbnail did in 48 hours what 2 decades of chemical programs at $30 million a year could not do at all. That is not a miracle. That is a functional guild restored to its ecological role, and the bill, for once, was zero. And so the bill was zero, but what the land received in return was something the accountants had no column for. Watch the sequence from the beginning, and watch each step fall. The Onthophagus gazella lands on a fresh 2-kilogram cattle pad, warm, nitrogen-saturated, sitting on compacted soil. And within minutes, it is not feeding on the surface, but driving vertical shafts straight down through the earth beneath it, packing brood balls into tunnels that bottom out at 30 centimeters below the surface. 30 centimeters of tunnel under a single pad, and you have to understand what cattle hooves have done to that ground before the tunnel arrives. Compaction from repeated grazing had hardened the topsoil to a resistance that resisted rainfall, sheeting water across the surface rather than letting it in, and those 30 centimeters of shaft reversed that in a single afternoon. Within 24 hours of a beetle population working a single pad, 3 dozen vertical shafts were acting as drainage channels that had not existed the morning before. And water infiltration into the soil beneath that pad increased measurably. Documented in Ian Daub's mid-1970s field assessments across paddocks in Queensland, the nitrogen that had been volatilizing as ammonia, rising off the pad surface into the air, lost entirely to the atmosphere, was now deposited 25 to 30 centimeters underground, directly inside the root zone of the pasture grasses, held there by soil rather than dispersed by wind. In physical terms, a single occupied cattle pad had become 3 interlocking systems at once: a nutrient delivery mechanism pushing nitrogen to root depth, a drainage network aerating compacted ground, and a parasite interruption point that eliminated the surface substrate entirely. All of it performed simultaneously by an animal weighing under 2 grams. Within 2 to 3 weeks of a functional population establishing on a trial paddock in Queensland, Daub's monitoring data recorded a measurable rise in pasture biomass in beetle active zones within a single growing season, grass that was visibly darker, taller, and denser than the untreated paddocks immediately adjacent to it. Now, you are probably asking yourself whether this could possibly hold at scale across millions of hectares, whether what worked in a monitored trial paddock could survive contact with an entire continent's worth of grazing pressure, seasonal drought, and an ecosystem it had never encountered before. That question is the right one, and the answer is coming. But stay with the sequence, because the parasite data changes everything you think you know about the scale of what was solved. The bushfly population in beetle-active paddocks dropped sharply, because the pad that fly, larvae required for a minimum of 3 days to complete development, was gone inside 48 hours of deposition, and larvae that could not finish that cycle did not survive it. And then the intestinal nematodes, the worms that cycled continuously through undisturbed surface pads back into grazing animals, lost the only transmission pathway they had. The pad was gone, the cycle broke, not disrupted, not reduced, broken at its physical foundation. By 1976, the monitoring reports from CSIRO were describing something that George Bornemissa, who had stood over a motionless cattle pad in 1959 and recorded nothing moving in it, had spent 17 years building the biological argument to make possible. A self-sustaining, reproducing guild of introduced species reshaping the land beneath Australia's feet, without a single invoice, without a single follow-up treatment, and without asking permission from anyone. And then the beetles stopped asking permission. The original program model had assumed a tidy, measurable expansion, population stepping outward from trial zones in Queensland, in patterns that field teams could follow on foot, season by season, clipboard in hand. Onthophagus gazella had been released at trial sites in Queensland in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the program entomologists expected it to spread the way a managed population spreads, carefully, incrementally, within the boundaries that temperature and rainfall modeling had drawn for it. It was beyond those boundaries by 1975. 5 years. That is all it took for a species the model had classed as range-limited to be documented in pasture zones that had been flagged as marginally suitable or entirely unsuitable for its establishment. The reason the model had been wrong was specific. Climate projections had been built on ambient air temperature. What the model had not fully accounted for was that a fresh dung pad runs several degrees warmer than the air above it, warm enough to extend the beetle's viable thermal range by a margin that, compounded across thousands of pads deposited daily, meant the effective habitat was substantially larger than any map had predicted. By the early 1980s, Ian Daub, reviewing spread data from Queensland and northern New South Wales, was recording beetle populations in locations where no deliberate release had ever occurred. They had arrived on their own through dispersal mechanisms and survival tolerances the program had not anticipated. Now, think about what that means for a moment. Some of it was straightforwardly good. The restoration was running ahead of schedule without any additional human intervention. But some of what Doob was documenting was genuinely complicated introduced species arriving in habitat that Australia's native dung beetle guild, more than 500 species, shaped across millions of years to process the dung of kangaroos and wombats, had been using without competition. You are probably asking by now whether the introduced beetles displaced native species, whether solving one ecological problem created another at a scale nobody had measured. That question was forming in the field notes too, and the answer is not clean. Stay with this because it matters more than the spread data. The competition for dung resources between introduced and native species was documented. Its long-term consequences for the native guild have not been fully resolved, and the scientists responsible for the program did not suppress that uncertainty. They published it, which is the only honest thing to do when a system behaves in ways that exceed your model. George Bornemisa, who had stood over a motionless cattle pad in 1959 and built a 17-year biological argument from that silence, had always understood this. You do not return a missing functional guild to a system running in deficit for 170 years and expect the outcome to match your projection. The system returns to a state of its own choosing. This is not a story of clean triumph. It never was. And when the monitoring records from 2003 finally confirmed what the land had been doing quietly for 35 years, what they revealed was not a program that had worked as designed. It was something far stranger and far more instructive than that. What the 2003 survey confirmed was not a vindication of the original design. It was something the designers had not had the humility to predict, and something George Bornemisa, now in his 80s, would have recognized immediately as the land writing its own answer. Self-sustaining populations had locked themselves into the continent's cattle grazing regions, across an area no single release schedule had mapped. Processing waste at rates the 1960s projections had not considered reachable within a human generation, and doing it without a single follow-up shipment, without a budget line, without anyone asking permission. Think about what that means for a moment. From the first deliberate release in 1968 to confirmed continental scale establishment in 2003, 35 unobserved, unmanaged, unassisted years. The recovery arc was longer than most institutional funding cycles and quieter than any press release. The soil told the clearest story. Paddocks with established populations showed water infiltration rates that, at some monitored trial sites, had doubled from the baseline measurements recorded before the functional guild returned. That is not a marginal improvement. That is the difference between a paddock that sheds rainfall and one that holds it, and the fly control costs. The chemical bills that graziers had absorbed across decades of failed suppression, were measurably and consistently lower in regions where the guild had re-established because the breeding habitat that had sustained fly populations for 170 years was no longer accumulating on the surface. The land was not waiting for a management plan. Ian Daub, who had spent decades moving between skepticism and documentation, from Queensland trial sites to continent-wide monitoring, said the thing that genuinely unsettled him was not the scale of what had been accomplished. It was how little the system had required from us once the missing animal was returned to it. And that is where I want to leave you with this story, because it is not a comfortable lesson for institutions that fund recovery work. A system does not recover because we hope for it, or model it, or petition for it. It recovers because when the missing gear is returned, physics does the rest. Drop your region, and one creature you have personally watched vanish from your local landscape in your lifetime. And yes or no in the comments. Have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent because the evidence says otherwise. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I'll see you in the field. Next, a single family of 4 beavers released into the River Otter in Devon, England, and within 5 years, flood frequency downstream had dropped measurably, and 2 fish species returned to stretches of water barren for decades. The Environment Agency formally opposed the Devon trial in 2014, arguing escaped animals would transmit disease to farmed fish, a position they held for 2 years before their own monitoring data dismantled it. The question that story leaves genuinely open is this: if 4 animals can restore hydrology that millions of pounds of engineered flood management could not, what exactly is the correct role of the engineer, the agency, or the animal?